Thank you, Tom, for that introduction. My thesis is titled Teaching Machines to Classify from Natural Language Interactions. So, if you think of the last 2 decades of NLP research, almost all of it has been about how statistical learning can help improve the state of language understanding. So, the work I'm going to present today as part of my dissertation is a part of a smaller body of research which actually explores the opposite question, that is, can natural language actually help machines learn better? So imagine that you want your personal mobile assistant to manage your email. For example, you might want it to send you a reminder if you haven't read an important email for several hours. So in order to do this, the agent would first need to understand what's this concept of an important email. And how would it know that? So in order to do this, uh, ideally you should be able to explain to the agent what an important email might look like, so that it can then use this information to decide if a new email is important or not. And in essence, this is the problem that my thesis really explores. How can machines learn classifiers for concepts such as important email from natural language advice, which looks like this? But before I get into the technical heart of my talk, I'd like to briefly mention the motivation which fuels much of this research, which is that our faith, which fuels much of this research, which is that language can help machines learn in ways that are more natural and also more effective. So usually when we think of machine learning, at the back of our heads, we are usually thinking of large collections of passively acquired data. And that's with very good reason. The inductive learning paradigm has been widely successful in a wide range of applications, but it does have some drawbacks. So I would claim that getting this kind of big data might actually be impractical for the long tail of learning problems. And that's because most real-world learning scenarios are often highly domain-specific or even individualized. So my notion of what's an important email is probably different from yours. Also, there are statistical limitations on what can be learned from labels alone. So learning theory tells us that the number of labeled examples you need roughly scales as log of the size of the hypothesis space. And technically, this should make learning of common knowledge representations such as ontologies impossible. On the other hand, this is something that children seem to learn with relatively few examples. So what's the mystery here? The reason for this dissonance might be that machine learning has largely exclusively focused on just learning from labels alone. And compare this with how humans learn. We do learn from passive observation, but we also learn from strategies such as explanations, instructions, interactions, and so on. In particular, if you think of human education and pedagogy, uh, most of it seems to revolve around processes which are very intimately connected with language. So you should think of reading from books, listening to lectures, engaging in student-teacher dialogue, and so on. And the reason why language is so effective as a medium of supervision for humans is that it has several core advantages. So it is by definition natural, in the sense that many learning tasks can be more easily conveyed through language than through inductive inference. So for example, learning a game of tic-tac-toe. On the other hand, language can also be more efficient in the sense that it could alleviate the sample complexity of learning and alleviate the need for labeled data. Finally, language is also more accessible to everyday users, in the sense that you don't have to be a domain expert in order to learn from natural language. But perhaps the biggest reason why we should be interested in teaching computers through language is that if we could really teach computers using the language of humans, they could be way more useful than they already are. So if you think of it, computers today can read and sense, listen and sense the world in ways that were not possible till just 10 years back. And imagine the kinds of things that might be possible if you could teach computers using language. So for example, I might say something like, whenever I have to catch a flight, alert me so that I arrive an hour before time. If I receive an important email, be sure that I read it within a day. When my bus reaches close to my stop, notify me. Or if there's a new publication relevant to my research, email that to me. So I hope that we agree that learning from language would be a worthy goal, but it's also highly challenging. And so in this thesis, I'm only going to talk about a very specific type of learning and very specific aspects of human language that enable it. So in any formulation of learning from interaction, there has to be, I believe there's going to be at least some core questions, and I list them here. So the first problem is the basic problem of actually learning to interpret language. That is, how can computers parse this kind of free-form natural language text, which looks like this, to some kind of symbolic logical representations that they can process and reason over. So this process of conversion from natural language text to these logical forms is usually referred to as semantic parsing. The second problem is what I call learning from interpretation. And this basically refers to the fact that even if you can perfectly parse language, you still need to get from those interpretations to some kind of use those interpretations to operationalize learning, in the sense that how do you get from interpretations such as these to a concept model or a classifier for something like important emails. And finally, there's a third aspect of learning of language, which is kind of distinct from these two, but it's can be really helpful for interactive learning, and which is that human language is naturally conversational. We don't just listen passively to teachers, but we engage them through strategies such as asking questions and seeking clarifications and so on. And so in this part, we are basically interested in, I'm going to restrict my focus on learning to ask appropriate questions on the part of meditation. So in my thesis, I explore aspects of each of these three basic questions. And this basically also constitutes the skeleton of my talk. I'm going to talk about these three questions in succession. The first is learning from interpretations, and I'm going to talk about two specific ways through which interpretations of language can be used to operationalize learning. In this part, we are going to assume that we do have a semantic parsing model to begin with. The second part is learning to interpret, or in other words, training semantic parsers. Here, the contribution of this dissertation is two new algorithms for semantic parsing, each of which incorporates a different type of pragmatic context from the environment to drive interpretation of language. And finally, I'm going to talk about learning to interact, where I'm going to focus on learning question asking strategies for this mixed initiative dialogue. So the thesis of this research is that machines can learn concepts from natural language interactions in ways that are similar to humans. In particular, machines can use language to compute rich and expressive features for learning tasks, provide constraints for statistical models by leveraging declarative knowledge, and interactively engage with humans to simplify the learning. At the same time, the ability to automatically interpret language can be guided by incorporating different types of pragmatic context. Such context can not only provide discriminative features for parsers, but also reduce the need for label data. So let me begin with the first part of my talk, which is the question of learning from interpretation. And first I'm going to talk about how natural language can provide a natural way to specify featured functions for learning tasks.